Well, hey everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. I want to talk about Canon 212 today, in relation to the question of dissenting from Catholic teachings of the magisterium in public. We'll often hear people cite Canon 212 as license to be able to express their dissent or their disagreement publicly in opposition to something that the Catholic magisterium has taught. And I want to 100% destroy and dispel anyone of such a notion, specifically the notion that Canon 212 allows for public dissent. It does not. And I believe I will conclusively demonstrate that today by first of all looking at Canon 212 itself, then going to Lumen Gentium 37 from the Second Vatican Council, from whence the canon derives, then taking a look at the sources that paragraph 37 from Lumen Gentium uses so that we properly understand what the Council Fathers are saying. And it's specifically an allocution from Pope Pius XII, which we'll take a look at. And he shows us what we can and cannot do whenever expressing our public opinion. And that again has bearing on how we understand Canon 212. I'll then also consider what Donum Veritatis from the magisterium teaches, a document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with papal approbation. So it's part of the papal magisterium. It is authoritative. We will consider that since it is a magisterial document released after the promulgation of the Code of Canon Law, 1983, Canon 212. So we properly understand Canon 212 in light of things that come after it. And I will demonstrate that Donum Veritatis explicitly forbids public dissent against magisterial teachings, even if they are teachings that are not taught by an infallible act. So they might be non-definitive teachings. It specifically has an entire section dedicated to prohibiting and condemning public dissent, which it sees as rooted in liberalism. So we will take a look at that, and I will wrap it up after that with some thoughtful words from Pope Pius X on the question of public dissent. After I've demonstrated this and made a case, I think it will be very clear that Canon 212 cannot be raised or cited as justification for Catholics to publicly express dissent against teachings of the magisterium, whether they be infallible or non-infallible in nature. Okay, so that's what we're up against. Now let me go ahead and share my screen, and we can take a look at some of this stuff together. Here we go. Let's start with Canon 212 itself. So let's just begin with all three paragraphs of this canon. So Canon 212, paragraph 1, conscious of their own responsibility, the Christian faithful are bound to follow with Christian obedience. Notice that there, Christian obedience, and we're bound to follow something? Bound to follow with Christian obedience those things which the sacred pastors, inasmuch as they represent Christ, in other words, insofar as they are exercising their authority over us as ministers of Jesus Christ. So in other words, when they teach in their magisterium, or when they impose disciplines as authoritative, in their office, we're bound to obey them in those things that they declare as teachers of the faith or establish as rulers of the church. So we are to assent. In fact, we are bound to assent to their teachings, and we are bound to obey their disciplinary decisions. So, as long as they are acting not in their private person, but as their um, in their authority over us as our pastors, we are bound to obey and assent. I think we often forget that part of Canon 212, and that's the first part of Canon 212. So, in other words, everything else that comes out after that needs to be understood in this context of an obligation to assent and obey whenever the church teaches and rules. Now, paragraph 2 of Canon 212, the Christian faithful are free to make known to the pastors of the church their needs, especially spiritual ones, and their desires. So we are free to let our bishop know that, hey, I really would appreciate, meeting this particular spiritual need, making provisions for this. So we're allowed to do that. Now, paragraph 3, this is the most relevant part because this is the part of Canon 212 that most people often cite, albeit incompletely and albeit entirely dismissing what we just read there in paragraph 1 of Canon 212. So let's read it here. According to the knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess. So, that obviously varies among people, right? Some people have more knowledge and competency in some areas versus others, right? So, according to knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess, they, that is the Christian faithful, this includes all, both the laity and the sacred pastors contextually, even though it's going to distinguish these people from the sacred pastors. Well, even the pastors have pastors. Even bishops have pastors, right? The Pope. According to the knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess, they have the right and even duty. Now, notice that even at times the duty to manifest to the sacred pastors, that is our shepherds, specifically our bishop, right? If I'm a layman, and I am a layman, right? If you're a layman, we have a right and sometimes even a duty to make known to our bishops our opinion on matters which pertain to the good of the church, and to make their opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful. The first priority is to make it known to our pastor, whatever my opinion is on a matter pertaining to the good of the church. I have a right and sometimes even a duty to make that known to my bishop, but not just my bishop, in some cases, also to the rest of the Christian faithful. And that's usually going to be done publicly, right? I mean, I guess I could make my opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful if I literally had everybody's email address, but I don't have everyone's email address. There's like 1.3 billion of us. So obviously this would be done publicly, right? Maybe on social media or something like that. So there's this duty to make known an opinion on matters of faith and morals, either to the bishop and or also the rest of the Christian faithful, without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals. So we're specifically not talking about matters related to faith and morals. I do want to point that out. So what might we be referring to here? Well, perhaps prudential concerns. I might have a prudential concern about something related to faith and morals. I mean, every matter of prudence is at some point related to a matter of faith and morals, but it's not immediately a matter of faith and morals. That is maybe my concern about a prudential judgment. But again, notice that stipulation there, that caveat. Most people often miss that. Without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals. Why? Because we're already bound to accept those teachings of our teachers on faith and morals, right? With reverence towards their pastors and attentive to common advantage and the dignity of persons. All right, that's the canon in its entirety. Now, there's a lot to discuss here. Because what some people are going to do is they're going to read this canon, and I've often seen people say, well, you see, right there, it allows me to express my disagreement with this Catholic teaching of the magisterium, because right there, I can make my opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful, and I have a duty to do it. Now, there's a lot of things that are wrong here whenever we conflate dissent with making our opinion known. When it speaks about making our opinion known, it is not at all allowing for expressing public dissent. That is not the kind of opinion that's allowed for here for many reasons. Number one, we were already bound to conform our intellect and will to the teachings of the magisterium. That's number one. Number two, we're going to see contextually the kind of expression of opinion here is specifically not public dissent for many reasons. First, let's just start with the context of the canon within the canon itself. Aside from paragraph 1, it says we have the duty to manifest this opinion. Now, let me ask you something. If this is allowing for us to publicly dissent from the church and to make that dissent known, dissent here being a rejection or disagreement with a magisterial teaching, if it allows me to do that, it says that I have a duty to do that. Now, does it qualify the kind of dissent that is spoken of here if it is speaking of dissent? Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't qualify it. So that would mean I could, in theory, according to this canon, I have a duty to even express my dissent against Catholic dogmas. So if I'm reading this as public dissent, according to this canon, I have a duty to express heresy publicly. That doesn't sound right, does it? No. I'm quite certain I don't have a duty to publicly dissent from dogmas of the Catholic Church, right? And some might say, well, you don't have that duty to express dissent against dogmas, but you have a duty to express dissent against non-definitive acts of the magisterium, things that are third level teachings of the Professio Fidei. Well, where does it say that? Where does it distinguish between these various levels? It doesn't. It doesn't at all. So if this is referring to dissent, upon what basis do you say it allows for me to dissent against some teachings, but not others? It just simply doesn't. And so it becomes nonsensical to read this just contextually as public dissent whenever it speaks of a duty. There's never a duty to publicly dissent from teachings of Christ's teaching authority on earth. That is nonsensical. There's no such duty. Because again, if there were, then that means I have a duty to express heresy. And this is absurd. That's just number one. That's obviously not the only argument I'm going to offer you here. I will also, in just a moment, I will show you what kind of opinion this is referring to by going to Lumen Gentium 37, from which this canon derives, and then also the allocution of Pius XII, who will tell us what kind of opinion is being expressed and what kind is not. But I'll also just remind you very quickly of, again, Donum Veritatis, a magisterial document released by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1990 with papal approbation right here. The instruction was adopted at a plenary meeting of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith and was approved at an audience granted to the undersigned Cardinal Prefect of the Supreme Pontiff, John Paul II, who ordered its publication in 1990. John Paul II. Now, John Paul II in 1990 is the same John Paul II in 1983 who promulgated the Code of Canon Law in Canon 212, right? Mhm, mhm, mhm. So the same one who is the lawgiver of the 83 Code of Canon Law and of Canon 212 is the same teacher in his authentic magisterium who has an entire section here, pretty lengthy section actually, against public dissent. From paragraph 32 on to, let's see here, we're still scrolling down because this is a lot here, on to paragraph 41. Pretty lengthy section here against public dissent. How is public dissent defined, by the way? Public opposition to the magisterium of the church, called dissent. And it includes not just opposition to infallible acts of the magisterium, but also non infallible acts of the magisterium. By the way, I do just have to once again remind you that public dissent is rooted in philosophical liberalism. Yes, yes. Immanuel Kant and others. That's where we get it from. Which is why I find it ironic, because it's usually the public dissenters these days who are also the ones who speak very negatively against modernism, which they should. Modernism is a heresy, right? Pius X. So I'm right there with them and speaking negatively against modernism. However, I do have to point out that they share some common roots with modernism when they engage in their public dissent. I just have to point that out in light of the fact that the magisterium has pointed that out. All right. Aside from that little tangent, okay. So the same Pope who promulgates Canon 212, where we have a right and sometimes duty to express our opinion, even to the rest of the Christian faithful publicly, is the same one who years later prohibits public dissent. That is, public expressions of a rejection of a teaching of the Catholic Church, even if it is something that is non definitive. And that is explicitly brought out in this section if you just read it. So it's, again, not limited to infallible acts of the magisterium. Okay. So the very one who promulgates it doesn't understand Canon 212 to give you license to public dissent. So then what kind of opinion is something that we have a right and even duty to manifest to our sacred pastors and to the rest of the Christian faithful? It would be identical to concerns, especially of the prudential order. I have concerns. Now, if you have difficulty in assenting to a teaching, so not just prudential judgments, but an actual teaching, Canon 212 is not where you want to go. Canon 212 does not give you have a right or duty to express those difficulties. Donum Veritatis, however, does give you the parameters for that. And Donum Veritatis tells you the parameters for that is privately. And it's not one of dissent, even in the context of private. It would just be, writing to your bishop saying, hey, look, I'm having real difficulty in assenting to this teaching of Pope Francis. I'm doing my best to try to understand this teaching of Pope Francis. I'm having a really difficult time with this thing. I don't see how it lines up with what Pius XII said or blah, blah, blah. Help me out here, kind of thing. I'm doing my best to try to harmonize these things. I'm not seeing how I can do it. It looks like I'm trying to square a circle here. Looks like there's a contradiction. I need your help because I'm having difficulty assenting to this. It allows for one to do that under certain circumstances after making an honest attempt and effort to understand it, and especially it's talking about somebody who's qualified and competent to do it. But the concerns at that point are communicated privately to one's sacred pastor. That's again according to the document, and nowhere allows for public dissent. Again, it has this entire long section against public dissent. So Um, Once more, Canon 212 does not allow for such expressions of difficulty with magisterial teachings. Canon 212 does allow, I'm sorry, Donum Veritatis does allow for some of those expressions, but only in a private setting with, for instance, sacred pastors, as you're bearing your heart to them and letting them know, hey, look, I'm having difficulty with this, help me out, kind of thing. But I want to just kind of give you the, the nail in the coffin here argument, because these are all just kind of preliminary arguments. I'm going to give you the nail in the coffin argument that Canon 212 does not allow for public dissent. Well, this whole section here, again, Canon 212, paragraph 1, 2, and 3, derives from the Second Vatican Council, paragraph 37. So Lumen Gentium from Vatican II, 37. It's kind of a copy and paste sort of thing. So that's where we get this from. And this isn't just my opinion. Like, open up any commentary on the Code of Canon Law for the Code of 1983 for the Latin Rite, and it will show you, hey, yeah, Lumen Gentium 37 is kind of the basis for this. And that should just be self-evident if you just read it, because it's kind of like a copy and paste thing. All right, so let's see what Canon 212 means in light of its source, which is Lumen Gentium 37. We have to understand canons, not in a vacuum, not isolated, even though if you do understand Canon 212 in isolation from everything else, the canon itself doesn't allow for public dissent, because it speaks of a duty of expressing this opinion, and there is no duty for manifesting heresy. So I would like to read this to you, fairly lengthy section, and then we're going to read where this derives from, which is Pius XII. Okay, so Vatican II, Lumen Gentium 37. The laity have the right, as do all Christians, so we're talking about all Christians here, not just the laity, to receive in abundance from their spiritual shepherds the spiritual goods of the church, especially the assistance of the word of God and the sacraments. We have a duty to receive the word of God, that is divine revelation, and the sacraments. Should not come as a surprise. They should openly reveal to them their needs and desires. Sounds like that whole paragraph 2 of Canon 212, right? Mm-hmm. With that freedom and confidence which is fitting for children and brothers in Christ. They are, by reason of the knowledge, competence, and outstanding ability which they may enjoy. This is, again, the language that you find in Canon 212, paragraph 3. Again, it's just kind of a copy and paste thing. Permitted and sometimes obliged, there it is, duty, once again, to express their opinion on those things which concern the good of the church. Again, just copy and paste, right? So obviously this is where it comes from. Now, you'll notice that little 7 in an asterisk. You see that? Now, this is in reference to expressing our opinion for the good of the church. So before I read the rest, we're going to have to take a little detour and see what this little footnote is about, because it tells us where this comes from. Okay. Well, when you go to it, there's footnote 7, Pius X, how great consolation, in the Acta Apostolica Sedis 42. And this was an allocution on the 17th of February, 1950. And yours truly was able to track it down so that you don't have to. I'll read it to you. If you go right here, I found it on the Vatican website, Pius XII, Speeches, 1950, February 17th. There it is, 1950. He's talking to Catholic journalists. There's some interesting points that he makes here. Let me find them for you. It's not a very long thing. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. You're welcome to go and read it at your leisure, but I will read you the relevant portion that is important and has bearing on what we're discussing today. If you read this section right here, he says, finally, we would like to add one more word regarding public opinion within the church itself. Naturally, in matters left to free discussion. That's an interesting phrase for Pius XII, isn't it? Some of you students of the magisterium, you're probably smiling right now. You know why? Because what does Pius XII think is not left for free discussion? Well, just a few months later, in Humani Generis, under section 20 of the document, this is where he speaks of non-infallible teachings of the papal magisterium, of like papal encyclicals, so of the Pope. And he says, of these teachings, he who hears you hears me applies to them, right? But then he says, but if the supreme pontiffs in their official documents purposely pass judgment on a matter up until that time under dispute, and again, it's in the context of not exercising the supreme power of their teaching authority. In other words, not infallible teachings. So these are non-infallible acts of the magisterium. If the Pope in their official documents purposely pass judgment on a matter up until that time under dispute, it is obvious that that matter, according to the mind and will of the pontiffs, cannot be any longer considered a question open to discussion among theologians. It's no longer open to debate. So when you read him saying things that are open to free discussion concerning matters of public opinion, it is explicitly for Pius XII, not magisterial things, not magisterial teachings. Magisterial teachings, even if they are non-infallibly taught, in other words, non-infallible acts of the magisterium, even if it's the ordinary magisterium, those are not left for free discussion, according to Pius XII himself, just a few months later. And just a few months prior, he says, concerning those public opinions that we can express, these are specifically ones that we're talking about that are left to free discussion. So when he's talking about expressing public opinions here, he's not talking about expressing a public opinion about something the church has already taught about and already decided, even if it's non-definitive. Ergo, he is not talking about public dissent. Public opinion and expressing public opinion for Pius XII, according to this, is explicitly not public dissent. Not public dissent. So, in other words, Canon 212 and Lumen Gentium 37, when it speaks of expressing this opinion publicly, it's not in reference to dissenting against a magisterial teaching. Not only contextually in the canon itself, but in the broader context of the canon, and then again in the very sources from which it derived. It continues. Only those who do not know the church or know it poorly can be surprised by this. In fact, she's a living body, and something would be missing from her life if public opinion were lacking. This lack, the demerit of which would fall on the pastors of the faithful. So in other words, our pastors need to hear from us. They need to hear that expression of opinion. But this is not an expression of opinion. That is a matter that has already been settled by the magisterium, even if it is a non-definitive settling of the matter, according to Pius XII himself. Once the magisterium teaches on a matter, even if it's non-infallible, it is no longer left to free discussion. And that is the background of Canon 212 when it speaks of this public expression, this expression of my opinion. Not only that, but I'll read to you from the exact same audience or allocution of Pius XII. Check out this money quote. He tells the Catholic journalist, have the courage, even at the cost of pecuniary sacrifices, to categorically ban from your columns every announcement, every advertisement that sounds offensive to faith or honesty. Not only is Pius XII not saying, hey, you got a right to publicly dissent, he's in fact saying, in fact, Catholic journalists, you guys need to suppress and ban public dissent against the magisterium, even if it sounds offensive to the faith. So it doesn't even have to be actually in opposition, even if it just sounds offensive to the faith. Ban it. So far from him allowing for public dissent, he explicitly calls for that to be banned, that to be censored. He is not allowing for that. He only allows for an expression of an opinion that is still open to discussion and debate, but matters that are taught by the magisterium, even non-infallibly, even when not exercising the supreme power of teaching authority, are no longer open to discussion. In other words, again, the sources of this canon conclusively demonstrate when we manifest our opinion, especially in the context of the rest of the faithful, it is not an opinion against the magisterium. So, I want to wrap it up by reminding you of Pius X, who, in his document, Prestantia Scripturae, on the Bible against the Modernists in 1907, the great hammer of heretics, reminds us about how public dissent against the magisterium is a grave sin. He says, wherefore we find it necessary to declare and expressly prescribe. And by this our act we do declare and decree that all are bound in conscience to submit to the decisions of the biblical commission relating to doctrine, which have been given in the past and which shall be given in the future, in the same way to the decrees of the Roman congregations approved by the Pope, such as fiducia supplicans. Nor can all of those escape the note of disobedience and temerity, and consequently of grave sin, who in speech or writing contradict such decisions. So if you are in speech on social media and in writing on social media contradicting the teachings of the magisterium, even if they're non-infallible, because Roman congregation teachings approved by the Pope are always non-infallible, because papal infallibility cannot be relegated to a congregation. They're always non-definitive acts of the papal magisterium. Consequently of grave sin, who in speech and writing contradict such decisions, he says, this is sinful if you ever do it. If you're ever publicly writing or speaking against that which the magisterium teaches, even if it's non-infallibly taught, grave sin, grave sin, grave guilt, to use his words elsewhere. And this besides the scandal they give. So not only is it a grave sin, we're creating scandal. So in other words, we don't have any room to speak and say, hey, you know what? I think Pope Francis with this document is creating scandal. You can't do that, because you yourself are creating scandal by doing what you're doing when you say that. And the other reasons for which they may be responsible before God for other temerities and errors, which generally go with such contradictions. So we'll give an account to God for this gravely sinful act. So once more to recap, we've seen Canon 212, contextually, in light of the whole thing, does not allow for public dissent. The very portion that people often appeal to, contextually, does not allow for public dissent. The instruction On the ecclesial vocation of the theologian, Donum Veritatis, a magisterial document by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1990, after the Code of Canon Law was promulgated by the same promulgator of the Code of Canon Law, specifically prohibits public dissent against the magisterium. So Canon 212 cannot be appealed to, because the very one who promulgates Canon 212 does not understand it to be public dissent. In fact, he excludes it. And we are not to go to that which is obscure and try to understand those things that are clear from those things that are obscure. Rather, it's the other way around. We go to those things that are clear, Donum Veritatis, and we understand those things that are obscure in light of those things that are clear. And again, Canon 212 is far from clear in allowing for public dissent, whereas Donum Veritatis is very clear in prohibiting public dissent. Once again, to recap, we also saw that Lumen Gentium 37 is where we get Canon 212 from. It does not allow for public dissent. In fact, we're obligated to submit to our shepherds. In fact, it says the laity should, as all Christians, promptly accept in Christian obedience decisions of their spiritual shepherds, since they are representatives of Christ as well as teachers and rulers. Let them follow the example of Christ, who by his obedience even to death opened to all men the blessed way of liberty of the children of God. So it specifically, where it speaks about us expressing our opinions, tells us we are bound to obey the teachings of our shepherds. Again, reiterating Canon 212, paragraph 1. And the very source of Lumen Gentium on expressing this public opinion is Pope Pius XII in his allocution. And in this allocution, he not only does not allow for public dissent in this expression of one's opinion, he specifically calls for Catholic journals to ban such things. And then lastly, we saw from Pius X that it is a grave sin to publicly dissent from magisterial teachings, even if they are non-definitive. One last point. We saw here, without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals in Canon 212, paragraph 3. So this expression that I have of my opinion that I'm making known to the rest of the Christian faithful is not, a matter of faith and morals specifically. Some might say, well, isn't faith and morals just limited to infallible teachings? No. We're confusing now some basic concepts. Let's walk through them together. Let me remind you, there are three aspects to the magisterium. There's the subject, there's the act, and there's the object. So we can speak of the subject of the magisterium, the act of the magisterium, the object of the magisterium. The subject is who teaches: Pope, College of Bishops. The act is how it is taught: definitively, non-definitively. So infallible, non-infallible, that pertains to act. Object refers to what is taught. Now, what is the object of the magisterium? It's always faith and morals, even when it teaches by a non-definitive act. See, act, again, infallibility, non-infallibility, that pertains to act, not object. But the object is always faith and morals. The object is not matters of history or science. The only exception to that is unless the matter of history or science necessarily relates by way of logical or historical necessity to a matter of faith and morals. But if it's just purely a matter of history or science, the church doesn't have an authority to teach on that. Like, the church cannot tell you 2 + 2 = 4 authoritatively. It might be able to tell you 2 + 2 = 4, but not authoritatively, not with the authority of Christ. It might be able to say, the members of the magisterium might be able to appeal to reason to say that, but they can't bind you with the authority of Jesus Christ that 2 + 2 = 4. They don't have that authority. We're using the wrong tools to substantiate 2 + 2 = 4 at that point. To know 2 + 2 = 4, we need to go to teachers of the natural sciences or, of arithmetics or whatever. Okay, so whenever we speak of the Object of the magisterium as faith and morals. Again, that pertains to either definitive or non-definitive acts. So when it speaks of without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, that's in reference to non-infallible or infallible acts of the magisterium. Um, so I think that this demonstrates conclusively that Canon 212 is being um, often abused by people. I see it nonstop. I've seen cardinals appeal to Canon 212 to express their public dissent over and against Donum Veritatis that specifically prohibits them from doing that. And it's not a good appeal because, again, it doesn't make sense contextually and it doesn't make sense according to the one who promulgated it. It also doesn't make sense according to the sources from whence it derives. And so I lastly just want to once again remind us and caution us not to engage in public dissent. It's perfectly fine to express concerns. That's effectively what Canon 212 is getting at. If you have a concern, especially, in the prudential order, I can see that. Now, if you have more than that, it's your difficulties with the church right now are not just a difficulty in the prudential order or something like that. You're really having difficulty assenting to the teaching itself, maybe of fiducia supplicans or of some other teaching, amorsa tisi or something like that. Okay. What Donum Veritatis tells you to do there is to, again, make an honest effort to try to understand these things. But at the end of the day, in very rare cases, one could privately withhold assent, but they are not allowed to publicly express their dissent against it. Privately withholding assent is not the same as publicly dissenting. And also, again, expressing some concerns and criticisms is not the same as dissenting. I can express some of my concerns and criticisms of perhaps Pope Francis. I can and have, without publicly dissenting against his teachings. Those are two different things. And I've always noticed that any time I talk about what the magisterium says about prohibiting public dissent, you know what I hear from people? So that means that I just can't express any concerns. No, that's not what's being said. There is a difference between expressing a concern and publicly dissenting. They're not even remotely close to the same thing. And I hope we're clear on the difference at this point. I also want to address those who say, this means that, I have to turn my brain off. No. Donum Veritatis allows for you to struggle and wrestle with these teachings. You need to turn your pride off, but you don't have to turn your brain off. If you're struggling and wrestling with the teachings of the church, it does say that, hey, that's understandable. That's not what's being prohibited. What's prohibited is publicly dissenting, publicly going against the teaching. That's not the same thing as privately struggling to assent to something. So, with those vital distinctions in mind, I hope this helps people see where the lines are, what we can and cannot do. And I hope it helps us stop abusing Canon 212 and also other appeals to free thinking and stuff like that. The church is not opposed to us using our brains. That is not the same as public dissent. Well, more to come on the topic of public dissent, because I do intend at some point to give a much more comprehensive treatment of this issue. It'll be much more lengthy than what I've offered so far. Perhaps I'll turn it into a book, but I have done a whole series of videos at this point on the question of public dissent. And often I kind of take a look at, a particular magisterial document or something. But at some point, I do intend to maybe take a broader view and go over the whole thing. But hopefully this will help until I do, offer such a detailed treatment on the subject. Hopefully this will hold us over. Hey, if you found it helpful, let me know. Put it in the comment section and hit that like button, and especially hit the subscribe button. The more you do that, the more YouTube will help me reach new people who haven't heard of the channel before. And it hopefully will give them something to think about when it comes to public dissent, especially if they're a Catholic who is publicly dissenting against the magisterium. Hopefully this will give them something to think about and pump the brakes on it, because right now it has become all too common to dissent against the teaching authority of Jesus Christ on earth, and to abuse canon law and other things while neglecting the very, very clear prohibitions against public dissent. And again, I hope this video helps people put things in perspective. So yeah, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and definitely leave a comment. All right, stay tuned for more. I'll be doing another video here in just a moment. We'll see you later. God bless. Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy, and engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.